1970, a Lithuanian seaman made a daring leap to freedom. The defection of Seamus Kudirka is no ordinary special. It's part of the WCCO CBS Reading Enrichment Program. And on Monday, January 23rd at 8 o'clock, many 7th through 12th grade students in the Twin City metro area will be learning with television through scripts like this, supplied by International Multi-Foods, the Minneapolis Star, and the St. Paul Dispatch. Try to make it a family affair.
Good afternoon, and we welcome you to Midday on this beginning of the week. Seated next to me, Ann Baxter, of course, an Academy Award-winning actress who gave up her career to move to Australia. It's all in her autobiography, and she'll be along a little bit later, and we'll talk about that. Also today, Bill and I are going to recall our visit with Senator Hubert Humphrey when we took our tour to the capital of our country in 1976. We'll see that also. But first, Bill with the news.
Thank you, Cindy. Thousands of people filed past the flag-covered coffin of Hubert Humphrey last night and today. All were there to say goodbye to a friend they loved and respected. Reporter Barry Peterson has this live report from the Capitol Rotunda. Barry?
Bill, through the night and still into this morning, the people have come. Sometimes a mass of people, sometimes just a trickle. But always, it seems, people walking by that flag-draped casket. It is incredibly cold out here to stand and wait to get in line. The temperatures have been below zero almost all the time. The wind chill, we are told, at times has been 40 below, and still they come. It's estimated by 1 p.m. when the body leaves the rotunda into the funeral procession for the funeral at House of Hope Presbyterian Church. By 1 p.m., between 26,000 and 30,000 people will have walked by. People from all walks of life. People who have driven, some of them, I'm told, several hundred miles to be here to pay their last respects to Hubert Humphrey. These were the common men, the men that Hubert Humphrey said he loved. And if this vigil is any indication, these are the common men who loved Hubert Humphrey as well. Live, I'm Barry Peterson. Back to you, Bill.
And we'll bring you continuous coverage of the funeral and burial services for Senator Humphrey beginning at 12:30 this afternoon and continuing all afternoon. Late last night, the senator's oldest son, State Senator Skip Humphrey, returned to the Capitol Rotunda. Quentin Neufeld talked with Skip about how the Humphrey family was holding up.
Senator Humphrey, could I ask how the Humphrey family seems to be enduring under the circumstances?
Well, I think very well, considering the circumstances. We're all a little bit tired, maybe, but there's a very warm feeling with the family, and we've just had, I must say, a wonderful experience in the sense of being close to each other and understanding each other.
We've been watching your mother in particular. She seems like a noble woman under the circumstances. Is she holding up pretty well?
Yes, I think so. I really think so. She, in the last several weeks, she's been under a great deal of stress, of course. She was very intensely involved in the care of my father. And now I think she knows that things are well and right.
We've been told that Senator Humphrey, your father, was interested in having a very simple, plain funeral. Of course, it's growing into something quite a bit larger than that. How do you suppose he would have felt about that?
Well, I think what he would most like is an appropriate ceremony, and I think that's what's happening. The most important thing, and the reason I came back here, is I wanted to see and know that the people were here, and they are. And it's a very friendly, in a sense, family feeling, and that's the way he was, and that's the way he knew Minnesota and knew the people of Minnesota, and so they're here to pay their respects, and I think that's really the kind of ceremony he would have enjoyed.
Are you at all surprised by the size of the crowd standing out in that 25 below wind chill, the size of the crowds in Washington, the amount of publicity the entire thing has gotten?
I'm just honored, and I'm glad to see that all of the years of his effort have shown that it really meant something, that his care for others showed that they care for him too.
And we'll return with more news right after this brief break.
With the creation of Wellaflex, sticky hairsprays are out of style. Wellaflex, enriched with provitamin B5 and natural plant protein conditioners, gives your hair super holding power with a soft, natural look. Use it day after day without sticky buildup.
With Wellaflex, I'm confident of a long-lasting hold that leaves my hair obedient, yet Wellaflexible. To me, it's a small miracle.
Discover Wellaflex, non-aerosol hairnet and setting lotion.
An important announcement for the mothers of America from the father of Mr. Bubble.
I am sitting in perhaps the most significant breakthrough in bubble bath history. We know you want bubbles, so we made Mr. Bubble powder bubblier. And we know you want mild, so we made Mr. Bubble milder. Not just a little milder, but milder than Ivory bath soap. We didn't get to be America's #1 kids bubble bath by just sitting around on our bubbles.
The Minneapolis Fire Department was called to a 2-alarm fire early this morning. A 2.5-story wood-frame duplex at 26th Street and 31st Avenue South was engulfed in flames when firemen arrived about 7:22 a.m. The occupants of the multiple dwelling escaped uninjured. One man had to flee into the cold morning air in just his underwear. The Red Cross was called in to provide clothing and temporary housing for the families. Arson investigators have determined the cause of the fire was a candle which ignited bed clothing. Most of the building was gutted. State troopers are back in Pope County today. They're on duty to protect surveyors and construction crews building a controversial power line. However, the Public Safety Department is refusing to announce how many patrolmen are in the area. Farmers have been protesting construction of the power line for months. Last week, 14 were arrested for interference with work crews. About 40 demonstrators protesting U.S. aid to Iran have gathered outside a hotel in Rochester where Empress Farah of Iran is staying. The Empress is in Rochester for a checkup at the Mayo Clinic. The demonstrators have been identified as members of the Iranian Students Association. Several Rochester police officers are stationed outside the hotel. So far, the protest has been peaceful. Empress Farah arrived in Rochester last night under tight security. No statement has been released about her health or how long she will stay in Rochester. Back in the Mideast, those peace talks between Egypt and Israel will get started tomorrow. Those talks were nearly called off because of an agenda problem. That problem has been solved with the help of U.S. Secretary of State Vance. Bob Simon has a report.
Chilling uncertainty, Egyptian Foreign Minister Kamel and his party decided to come to Israel after all. They were greeted at the airport by Foreign Minister Dayan, whose welcoming statement was general and conciliatory. Kamel went into specifics.
There can be no peace with the occupation of land. There can be no peace with the denial of the national rights of the Palestinian people, foremost among which the right to self-determination.
Shortly after arriving at the Jerusalem Hilton, an Egyptian spokesman said it was Secretary Vance's mediation which had resolved the crisis over the wording of the Palestinian item on the agenda.
Minnesota law enforcement officers are looking for 31-year-old James Goki. The Beloit, Wisconsin man escaped last night while on furlough from the Minnesota State Prison at Stillwater. Prison officials describe Goki as a 150-pound, 5'10" white man. He has brown hair, a ruddy complexion, tattoos on both arms, and a scar on the left shoulder. Weather forecast for the Twin Cities remains brisk, cold, clear, sunny skies. Clear and colder tonight, partly sunny, and continuing cold on Tuesday. The highs this afternoon expected to be only from 0 to 4 above. The lows tonight 18 below to 24 degrees below zero. The highs Tuesday about 5 degrees above zero. Our present temperature is 3 below. That's 19 below Celsius. Winds northwesterly at 10 miles per hour. The wind chill right now minus 25 Fahrenheit. At noon, the stock market is down. The Dow Jones averages are down more than 1.5 points. And don't forget, WCCO Television will have continuous coverage of the Humphrey funeral starting at 12:30 right after midday. In just a moment, we'll be back to talk with Ann Baxter, Academy Award.
Park Furniture's everyday price to remanufacture your sofa or chairs is about half the cost of new. Well, right now, during Park's annual January clearance sale, you can get an additional 20% off the cost of both fabric and labor. For example, Park will remanufacture your sofa or 2 chairs in budget-saver fabrics for only $127. Only $127 to have a like-new sofa or chairs. Not bad. Call Park right now to make a free home appointment. Call Park at 822-3157.
Baxter's autobiographical story, finally out in paper book, called Intermission. Ann Baxter's with us today. You know, Ann, that title is really quite significant because, well, in essence, that's what you did. You took an intermission from your...
Yes, but it's...
but it's been a long intermission.
It's about as far from a nice, quiet chat in the lobby between acts as you can get.
You really did give up your career and...
Yes, I did. I
make
fell
a journey to Australia.
Passionately in love with a man who'd never seen me in a movie. Maybe it was just as well.
Is that why, perhaps? Because he had never seen you? Was that refreshing rather than...
Yes, it was. And he was refreshing. What is it? I described him as a thrown-up window in a stuffy room. He was a marvelous guy. And I just dropped my life and went toward a new adventure.
Would you do it again?
You have to do that once in a while. Would I do it again?
Yeah.
No, I couldn't physically do that again. Not with what I had to do down there. But I wouldn't give you anything for the experience. It taught me what I have here, taught me how rotten spoiled I was.
Yeah.
At least if you're going to be spoiled, which anyone in America is, you might as well know it. As long as you know it, it's not quite so bad. You can enjoy it as you sink into the feathers.
You know, it's interesting. I keep comparing the way you say that with the way most people refer, most men who have spent time in the Army refer to their Army experience. It was terrible, but I wouldn't give it up for the world because I learned so much.
Well, it's their baptism of fire. It was my baptism of fire. I hit low moments down there. It's funny. In this particular town, on this particular day, I've been thinking about Humphrey, and he's hit so many really low moments and has come up out. There's a sort of phoenix bird that we have to awaken in all of us.
Yes.
And we have to come up out of the ashes of our defeats. And I was defeated time and time again down there. But it makes you grow. It really does.
Australia.
If you can stand it. If you live through
Yes.
it, you know, you come out of it.
It's still a frontier, though. But I imagine...
Oh, I think so. I don't think Giro's changed very much.
No.
I've been invited back down by the current mistress of Giro.
Are you going to go?
I'd love to go.
Yes.
Love to go, yes.
It is. We don't want to imply that just the very fact that Australia was involved made it a trying experience.
Oh, no.
It was a trying experience because
It was heaven and hell, cheek by jowl. No,
you were way in the outback, and physical problems that came up were tough to cope with as a result of not being near medical care and that kind of thing.
That's
and,
right.
And because of that fact,
No,
it was difficult.
There was nothing wrong with where I was. It's just that I didn't know anything about it, you see. The people who've grown up with that kind of country, I mean, we're on a cattle station 35 miles from the nearest town. That's considered close in. I mean, if you're talking about 400 miles or 200 miles, of course, then the government worries about you. They couldn't care less if you're really close to town, like 35 miles in an hour and a half in a Jeep. You know?
Incidentally, a cattle station is what we would refer to as a ranch.
That's right. Cattle station property.
Good
That's
point.
Right.
You know, I am so involved with my career at this point and love it so much, I can't imagine giving it up. When you were finally arrived in Australia, wasn't it an incredible sense of
I had been working
loss?
since the age of 13. I
Yes.
was 36. If I'd been a civil servant, I could have retired with a pension. Hell, I'd worked and worked and worked and worked, and I loved it. And I'd had many careers, all sorts of careers, because you have, it's always a roller coaster. But something was changing in the business. What was it I said in the book? You'd ask an actor what he was doing, and he'd tell you his latest tax dodge, you know. Really, it got to be like that. Entourages of business managers and tax men and all this sort of thing, and I didn't like that. That wasn't what I had set out to do. And the whole business was in flux then. I don't know. Oh, everything came together, and I set eyes on this total stranger to my world, I to his, and we...
Lightning hit.
Yes, the Sicilian thunderbolt.
I read a book called To Love Again, in which the author talks about the miracle of love, and that when it really occurs, that coming together is a miracle, and as far as I'm concerned, that's what happened to you.
Yes, it did.
The loneliness, the emotional strain, the psychological
the rats,
strain.
the maggots, the fleas,
were combined,
free to the pig.
were combined with the miscarriage which you had in that surrounding, which was very, very difficult.
Yes.
This kind of testing, I would imagine that would make an even better actress.
It was my war.
Would it not?
My war with Europe.
Yes.
Would it not make an even better actress to have experienced these
Well, I think
extremes?
anything makes you a better actress. You're your own toolbox, and life is, you know, it hollows you out deeper and deeper and deeper if you can put up with it. And makes you grow, certainly. Everything you experience is what you use.
Absolutely.
What would you like?
Europe was my monkey wrench.
What would you like for the next couple of years to bring you? Obviously, I know you end by talking about making yourself available once again to the people who had helped you so much.
Well, I've done many things since Australia.
But what would you like to do now?
Well, I married in January, and he died in October, so I've had quite a year. And my father died in December, so I took a sabbatical when I married David, and now I think, as always, the great panacea is work. They want me to do another book. The producer's interested in making it into a film. I have a play script with me that's brilliant. It'll all...
You've learned from Humphrey how to come up. You really
I think anyone could.
Yes, that's beautiful.
It's a remarkable story. It's all in this book called Intermission, written by Ann Baxter, about one portion of her life. Only one. There have been many and will be more. Thank you very much, Ann.
Thank you, Bill.
We'll be back in a moment. Don't go away.
There are times when only flowers can say what you feel. The North Central Florist Association wishes to remind you that flowers are a living symbol of your thoughtfulness.
In 1970, a Lithuanian seaman made a daring leap to freedom. The defection of Seamus Kudirka is no ordinary special. It's part of the WCCO CBS Reading Enrichment Program. And on Monday, January 23rd at 8 o'clock, many 7th through 12th grade students in the Twin City metro area will be learning with television through scripts like this, supplied by International Multi-Foods, the Minneapolis Star, and the St. Paul Dispatch. Try to make it a family affair.
You know, the same old hot cereals can get a little dull, day after day after day. For a nice little change, try Malt-O-Meal, regular or chocolate. A smooth and creamy hot wheat cereal with the rich taste of malt. Malt-O-Meal.
Want to try something better than the powder? It costs a lot less this year.
Liquid Aetrex 4L.
Come on, give it a pour. Try Liquid Aetrex 4L. It's the only way to find out what it's worth to you. Want to try something better than the powder? It costs a lot less this year.
Liquid Aetrex 4L.
Come on, give it a pour.
You know, so frequently people have asked me what perhaps was the most exciting interview I've ever done, and I have often replied that it was an interview I did with Martin Luther King in the midst of a very, very difficult situation when his life had been threatened and so forth. About a year and a half ago, we did a program honoring Dr. King, and one of our guests on that program was Senator Humphrey, who talked about his experiences, his feeling with Dr. Martin Luther King. And here's part of that interview now.
Now I think back over my first impressions of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I've always been involved in the civil rights movement. It's been very close to me. I believe in equal opportunity as a matter of conviction, not just a matter of convenience. And I remember about this young minister, Baptist minister, leading marches. I remember those freedom rides and freedom marches. And I recall that day in August of 1963 when I was the United States Senator. Gene McCarthy and I were there, and there were plans for at least 250,000 of our fellow Americans coming to Washington D.C. And the city was worried, and the officials were worried, And I made a speech in the Senate that day saying that this was going to be a peaceful meeting. It was going to be a great day for America. It was when the American people were going to descend upon Washington, not to destroy it, but to save it. Not to cause trouble, but to bring joy to that great capital city. And literally hundreds of thousands of people did come, and we marched peacefully down those streets. I recall going to a little church in the morning and meeting with our Minnesota delegation. And then we joined in with the multitude and marched down towards the Lincoln Memorial, down through the mall. And there was literally a sea of faces, and I sat there on the platform at the Lincoln Memorial and listening to the speakers. And I recall when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Arose to speak. And those memorable words when he said, "I have a dream," I can hear his voice ring out, and it had a marvelous tone of purity and clarity. And there was at least 250,000 people sitting out on the grass and on the steps as far as the eye could see down the mall of the Capitol. What a beautiful day, marvelous sunlit day, bright sunshine. Everybody of the guards and the police and all were worried that something was going to get out of hand, but it didn't. And Dr. Martin Luther King gave that great plea to America, that great message, the dream that he had when he said that my children, I want my children to be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the quality of their character. It was a moment of really revival of American democracy and of hope in this nation. It was one of the great moments of history. Well, after that, I went back to the White House and talked with President Kennedy and gave him a full report on what had transpired. And President Kennedy invited into the White House, and I was one of those present, the leaders of the civil rights movement that had put on this, or brought about this great freedom march, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was there. That was one of several meetings that I sat in with him, because later on, after President Kennedy's death, we also had meetings with President Johnson, and Dr. King was there. So I've had a rare privilege in my life, not to know Dr. King as an intimate personal friend, because that would not be true, but to have been inspired by his leadership, to have sat at his elbow, so to speak, to have been with him, to have heard him speak, to have been present with him when he came back, for example, from Oslo, where he had received the Nobel Peace Prize. I was with him in New York at the great Armory meeting there, a tremendous reception. Both he and I spoke that evening in New York City. And then I recall, of course, attending his funeral in Atlanta. Mrs. Humphrey and I went there, and it was a moment of tenseness and tension, and really it was almost unpredictable what would happen. And literally hundreds of thousands of people gathered together, that little church just filled with people. And his lovely little family, Coretta King, she's a good personal friend of mine, Mrs. King, and his father and his mother. Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. has been one of my close personal friends. So the family has had, we've had family connections, so to speak. And we will always miss Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But the works of a good man are immortal. He changed the history of America. That letter to his fellow ministers from a Birmingham jail, I had my students read that. That's one of the great documents of American history. This man, Dr. Martin Luther King, never preached violence. He preached martyrdom. He preached patience. He preached persistence. He preached a sense of commitment. But one of the documents that should be read by every young man and woman in America is that letter of Dr. Martin Luther King when he was imprisoned in a Birmingham jail, I believe it was. And he was there only because he wanted to exercise his rights as a child of God and as a citizen of the United States. He brought together a magnificent relationship between matters of spirit and faith and religion with matters of political action and political purpose. And he did it in a way that was constructive. I think people must remember that this man never once ever preached violence. He had that quiet courage of a man of faith, which of course is the truly great courage.
You know, it's interesting how many of the things he said about Martin Luther King apply equally to him.
Yes.
Remarkable human being. Miss Baxter, did you ever meet our Hubert Humphrey?
No, but I'll tell you something. Being in his state today, I feel as if I have.
Well, we all do, everyone who hasn't met him.
It's the most extraordinary thing I've ever seen.
He is the kind of man that if he had met you once for a brief, maybe 2 minutes, he would remember who you are 2 years later.
Everyone who had ever met him felt that they knew him. Not only thought they knew him, felt they knew him. A young man, Wendell Anderson, our other senator, said the other day a young man was lowering a flag at McAllister College where Senator Humphrey had taught at one time and said, "Today I lost a friend and I never met him."
Yes, that's lovely.
Last year before last, 1976, our bicentennial year, Cindy and I, you may recall on this program, Cindy and I led a group of Minnesotans to our nation's capital, to the home of, at that time, Senator Walter Mondale and Senator Hubert Humphrey, and they joined us at the national capital, and it was fascinating to see the exuberance about which we speak so frequently when we talk about Senator Humphrey. How much he wanted to share with us his excitement of the
wanted everyone to know the history of this country and how important it was.
And how much he knew about the history. He could go from one portion of the Capitol to the other and point out, as well as the tour guides, exactly where this came from and who had spoken here.
Not just history, but anecdotes and bills that had been passed and situations that occurred.
Here is our, at that time, our senior senator, strangely enough, Walter Mondale, who was our senior senator at that moment, entering the room and talking with our group of people. And then a little bit later, Senator Hubert Humphrey entered, and of course, equally beloved, and what a remarkable team they made.
You know, I'll never forget, Bill, that afternoon when the two of them were in there, and here comes Humphrey, and you asked them if one of them was going to be in the executive branch of the government the following election.
And of course, we had all at that time were thinking of Senator Humphrey, but of course it turned out to be his close friend, Walter Mondale. You know, the bit of film we just saw about him talking about Martin Luther King was interesting because I had asked him to do 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes for us about Dr. King, and he spoke nearly 8 minutes. This, of course, was something that Hubert Humphrey kidded about. Here he is speaking to our group at that time, something he kidded about all the time. But it wasn't what we refer to in our industry as fill. Every moment of it was meaningful. And always Hubert Humphrey was meaningful in everything he said.
He meant every word of his life.
He did. And his memory will stay with us for a long time. We would hope that you stay with us throughout this afternoon as Channel 4 spends its time at the Capitol Rotunda, going to the House of Hope. President Carter will be there, and Vice President Mondale will be there, and many, many of his colleagues from Congress will be there. And we hope that you will be there via WCCO television. Have a pleasant day. See you tomorrow.
I can't play another note till I wet my whistle.
Here, Grandpa, new Country Time apple cider flavor.
Hey, Country Time with a taste of good old-fashioned apple cider. That is new.
Yep, got a crisp apple taste I like.
And it's really refreshing.
It's great for wetting your whistle, huh, Grandpa?
Darn tootin'.
New Country Time apple cider flavor beverage mix.
From your fingers to your toes, you got just one set of permanent clothes. And with a little daily care, it'll last through years of wear,
Looking soft,
feeling smooth,
looking cute.
Take care of your birthday, take care of your birthday, take care of your birthday soon. Livia!
Whatever skin you're in.
One thing's for certain. Just about every night at this time, I'm right here fixing dinner for the family. Tonight, it's luk shoi chicken chow mein. Sometimes it's beef or shrimp or pepper oriental. Heat the meat and gravy from the top can and add the crisp oriental vegetables from the bottom can. Serve it with la choy chow mein noodles or rice and la choy soy sauce. Just think of it.
La choy makes Chinese food. Swing American.
Think of it.
This afternoon's regular programming will not be seen today in order that we can bring you a special report. Hubert H. Humphrey, a final farewell. Continuing coverage of the funeral and interment of Senator Humphrey. Here is Dave and Doug Moore.
Good afternoon, everyone. The long vigil that began way back Friday evening will end this afternoon, just as the sun is setting over the state Hubert Humphrey so revered. During the next few hours, the body of Senator Humphrey will be moved from the rotunda of the state capitol to the House of Hope Presbyterian Church on Summit Avenue in St. Paul, and then on to the Lakewood Cemetery in Minneapolis for burial.
One of the largest gatherings of national dignitaries ever assembled will be in the Twin Cities this afternoon to pay their final respects to the man they knew, they respected, and moreover, they loved. President Carter will head that list, which will also include the cabinet and many of the nation's congressmen.
In the next 4.5 hours or so, we will provide continuing uninterrupted coverage of the final farewell to Senator Hubert Humphrey. For a more detailed preview now of the events forthcoming this afternoon, we'll go first to Barry Peterson and Cindy Bucatu, who are near the state capitol.
Dave, as you can probably see, the Capitol is behind us, and there are still people walking in to pay their last respects to the body of Hubert Humphrey. Essentially, this is the way it's going to work. At about 1 p.m., the funeral procession will pull up to the Capitol. The military honor guard that has accompanied the body each time will drive up to the Capitol, and the body will be placed into the funeral procession. We understand it will come past here to the House of Hope Presbyterian Church. The funeral service there begins at 2 p.m. President Carter will be here. Former President Ford will be here. Vice President Mondale will be here. A number of dignitaries, cabinet officers, entertainers, people of that sort. A number of U.S. senators who left Washington early this morning to be here for the funeral. There will be a minister of the church, Calvin Didier, will speak, Archbishop John Roach, Rabbi Mac Shapiro from Temple Israel, and the Reverend Robert Schuller from Garden Grove, California. Mr. Humphrey requested a funeral that would, as he said, be something of a celebration and something for the common people. That may not necessarily happen. There are about 3,000 seats in the church, and all but about 600 have been reserved for those who have tickets. In other words, those who were invited. About 600 seats will be open to the general public.
Barry, as you mentioned, it is going to be a state funeral. Senator Humphrey wanted it to be a celebration, but I think there's going to be a great deal of pomp and ceremony attached to this. Certainly what you would expect to accompany the death and interment of a man like Senator Humphrey. Probably maybe even a little bit awesome to the people, the common people, the little people, as we've all been referred to, who have known Senator Humphrey all these years, and who are going to be watching this with, as I said, a certain amount of awe that there would be such a turnout of national prominence.
I guess the really surprising thing, and maybe it isn't so surprising, the cold out here is almost unbearable. It's the wind chill, we're told, has sometimes been down to 40 below. And people waited through the night. There were a mass of people last night at 8 o'clock when the rotunda was open to the public. And they have been trickling through, we were told, all day long. They estimate perhaps 26,000, perhaps as many as 30,000 people will have walked through the rotunda before the body leaves at 1 o'clock. And it's not so hard to understand, I suppose, if you remember the kind of man that Hubert Humphrey was. And I was thinking about this a little while ago, and something came to my mind, I guess a very special incident. I was at the airport about a month ago in December when Vice President Mondale came back to Minnesota with Senator Humphrey, bringing him back home for Christmas. And the senator walked into a hangar at the airport for something of an impromptu press conference. We were asked not to ask questions, but of course no one could resist, and the senator could not resist talking and answering our questions. And when it was over, the members of the Twin City Press Corps who had known Humphrey stopped to shake his hand. And I had not known him quite that long, but he spotted me in the crowd, and I was back behind cameras and gear and things of that sort, and he had met me maybe 2 or 3 times personally. I've covered him several times. He saw me in the crowd, and he said, "There's a friend," and he stretched his hand across 3 or 4 other people, and I reached out and shook hands with him. And that was just the kind of man he was. He knew who you were, he remembered you, and he really just wanted to be friendly with you, and almost without any kind of ostentatious attitude at all. And I remember some of the comments from the people in Waverly yesterday who talked about how he was a man who would just kind of walk down the street and he would just sort of talk about ordinary things with people. A man who was a former vice president, an extremely well-respected U.S. senator, as today's events certainly prove, and as the events of the last couple of days certainly prove. And yet he liked to walk down the street and talk to people and kind of see how they were and how business was going and things of that sort. And I guess it seems incongruous unless you knew Senator Humphrey, and if you knew him, it seemed very typical.
Oh, Barry, many people have been doing just what you did now during these last 2 and 3 days, recalling incidents and reminiscences of the senator and recalling them in a very personal way. There was no distant admiration present in most of the people that we all have talked to. He was very much a man, very much a human, and even now as we see the casket in the rotunda, the spirit is very much present.
Okay. We'd like to go back to the studio now to Dave and Doug.
You know, Dave, I met someone today, and they said they were surprised at the number of people that have filed by to pay their respects to the senator here, not only in St. Paul, but back in Washington, D.C. And I personally wasn't surprised at all, because I feel that not only the Humphrey family, but the state of Minnesota and the nation as a whole has suffered a death in the family. I think that Hubert Humphrey was close to everyone. Like someone said today, they lost a friend, and they had never even really personally knew him.
Doug told me something surprising. I wouldn't know when your birthday is. Doug shared the same birthday with Senator Humphrey, May 27th. Was that a big deal in your life when you were...
It was when I was small.
When did you leave Marshall? How old were you when you left Marshall?
I was 13. Yeah.
But that meant something to you?
Well, my grandfather was raised on 2 things, WCCO radio and Hubert Humphrey. I grew up to respect both of them, yes. And Hubert Humphrey, well, I'll tell you something. I was very young, and I was just starting in this business. It was the 68 campaign. And I was in California working at a television station. And they announced that the senator was coming to campaign there, and I was going to do a half-hour interview show. And in walks the senator, and he was bigger than life, and we sat down on this set together, and it was very lonely out there. Here was this kid just starting out in the business. And so what happened is that as we were sitting there, the director walked out, and he said they had dropped a number of commercials in the show, and we'd have to fill an extra 4 or 5 minutes. And the senator reached over and he sort of hit me on the shoulder, and he says, "Doug," he says, "don't worry." He said, "I'm sort of a motor mouth anyway," and he says, "Well, we'll do it." And he gave me a wink. And after the show was through, I walked off, and a number of people came up to congratulate me on how well I had handled the thing. And I thought to myself, it wasn't me who handled it well, it was the senator who went out of his way to make me look good, and he especially did. He realized that I was new in the business, and it meant a great deal to me. And I think, again, it was, he knew I was a home state boy.
It was similar to what, I think it was Chuck Lilligren who said about the retirement of Maynard Speech the other day. He'd never leave you hanging there.
That's right.
He'd always, of course, someone had probably done that with him at some time, too.
Well, it's like Warren Spanis said the other day. Warren Spanis was commenting on some of the flack he was getting during his gun control legislation and that. And he said Humphrey would walk up and put his arm around you and just let some of his charisma roll off on you. And he was that kind of an individual. He was bigger than life, not physically, but as a man. And he was not afraid at all to release some of that to other people.
One of the other points of visitation today during this afternoon and the final farewells to Hubert Humphrey is we shall be going to Twin Cities International Airport, I believe, at about 1 o'clock. At about the same time, the casket is departing from the rotunda in the state capitol. The first of the congressional delegation will be arriving in the Twin Cities, I believe, in 4 plane loads. and then the cabinet members, and at 1:35, President and Mrs. Carter will arrive. Larry Schmidt and Dal Austin are at Twin Cities International now, making preparations. Gentlemen?
Dave, it must be every bit as cold here beside the runway at the Air Force Reserve Station at Twin Cities International as it is outside the Capitol. Here are the plans. The jets are all in the air. There are four jets already in the air carrying members of Congress from Washington to here, members of Senator Humphrey's second family, you might say. They are due to arrive here beginning at about 1 o'clock at 5-minute intervals. And then, scheduled at 1:35, although at last word it was a little bit early, a very small jet, a Jetstar, carrying President Carter. Only President Carter, not Mrs. Carter, President Carter and Paul Sarbanes, senator from Maryland. They should arrive at about 1:35. Larry Schmidt has a rundown of the numbers of people on these planes, the senators and congressmen.
Actually, there are a total of 165 senators and representatives and various members of the House and Senate staff, and even some administrative officials who are probably not going to recognize when they come down off the plane. But there are about 36 senators and 17 representatives who are coming, and many of the senators and representatives coming with their wives. And in some cases, the wives of some of the senators and representatives coming themselves and not the officials who we recognize.
I don't know if you can still hear us with the noise. A jet has just landed, but this should not be one of the jets from Washington. All right, let's go back to you, Dave, in the studio.
Doug? There's just one thing. Humphrey aides said memorials may be sent to the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. That's box HHH, Minneapolis, Minnesota 55401. So if you are considering sending some kind of a memoriam, it would go to the Hubert H. Humphrey Memorial Institute of Public Affairs.
Until this time, we've been accustomed to seeing the strong military honor guard that accompanied the senator's body from the U.S. Capitol to the state capitol. The names have been revealed today of those who will be the pallbearers. They will be the members of the Humphrey family, Skip, Doug, and Bob Humphrey, and Bruce Solomonson, the husband of Nancy Humphrey Solomonson, and Fred Gates and David Gartner. David Gartner is probably more familiar to us as the man who made the announcement that cold night last Friday evening at Waverly before the gathered press about the passing of Senator Humphrey. I believe now Karen Boris, is Karen Boris standing by? Is she at the state?
It's some time.
I see.
There was one thing today. Senate Democratic leader Robert Byrd said the time is right for passage of the Humphrey-Hawkins full employment bill. Byrd says the legislation should be given top priority in the coming session of Congress. He says the death of Minnesota Senator Hubert Humphrey may have provided an atmosphere to encourage the passage of that bill.
And still they come through, viewing the body. They have about 17 minutes at 1 o'clock. The body will depart, will be taken from the rotunda of the Capitol and moved to the Hope Presbyterian Church, which is on Summit Avenue, which is about 2 miles from the state capitol. Just minutes from now, as we say, the doors of the state capitol close. The body of Hubert Humphrey will be carried those few blocks away, where all of the nation's leaders, the congressmen, the cabinet, President Carter will say their last farewell. The scene at the capitol, that scene has been reserved for all of the people.
Last night there was a 2.5-hour wait. This morning the wait had dwindled, but the cold lingered. At dawn the wind chill was nearly 40 degrees below zero. Still they came. Some 20,000 had walked through the doors of the state capitol before the sun slipped up over the horizon. There were folks stopping on their way to work. More than a few had called in sick. Students cut class. Because somehow on this day, being here was more important than being any place else on earth.
All the teachers got together and decided that we wanted to do this, and then we asked the students, and they chose to come. every one of them came.
And the bus had 15 minutes notice?
That's right.
Okay, fine. Humphrey was a man who didn't want to be elaborately eulogized, a last wish his people wouldn't grant. But perhaps this crowd, this last crowd, is something he would have enjoyed.
I think he'd be delighted. I really do. Just absolutely delighted. These are his people. These are the people that he's worked for his whole life. Just absolutely delighted.
So why do people brave the cold and the line for a quick walk past a casket? Certainly to show their respect, but also, as one woman said, to show the Humphrey family that the love of this man has triumphed over death. Karen Boris, WCCO Television News at the state capitol.
The senator said that he wanted the day to be a celebration of joy, and I think it's rather odd, though, that even though we have bitter cold outside, the sun broke through today, and it is a rather beautiful day outside.
One would think that that's a part of the spiritual omen.
That's right.
That the senator carried with him.
Well, last night, the friends of Hubert Humphrey filled the Capitol steps, an overflowing of people and an outpouring of emotion, sometimes bursting into song, and Jim Newman was there.
It was a bone-chilling cold. The wind lashed across the Capitol steps, cutting through clothing, stinging faces, creating a wind chill of 25 below. But still, the crowd waited, huddled, shuffling and stomping, trying to keep warm. For some, the wait lasted 2 hours, but there were few complaints. Though a small number of mourners gave up, most held on. They said it was the least they could do for the great man.
I've lived in Minnesota for about 5 years, and in that time I've had an opportunity to meet Senator Humphrey, and I guess see the impact that he had on a lot of people. And I was very impressed, and I wanted my son to come here tonight and take part in an opportunity of honoring somebody that's had such an impact on so many of our lives.
He's just an impressive person, a fantastic person, a person with a lot of spirit, an inspiration.
I live in Milwaukee, and I drove here from Milwaukee. I just got here a few minutes ago, and I think that Senator Humphrey was one of the greatest senators that ever lived.
Well, there are many people who feel that he was a great senator, but there are very few, I would imagine, who would drive here all the way from Milwaukee.
I loved you very much. He was one of the greatest humanitarians that I've ever known.
What brought you out here on a brutally cold night like this?
We have two retarded children who are no longer children. They are 24 and 23 years old. They are both employed. They're both earning their own way in life, and it is all as a result of this man who has done so much for our country and for all people who needed his help in human rights.
He honored my son when he was Boy of the Year down in Washington, D.C. He called him into his office, and several years later, he knew him by his first name when we met him in the Hotel Lowry.
With the lights, the cameras, and the crowd, the mood here seemed almost festive at times. Still, sorrow is a very personal thing. And for many on this vigil, the true feeling would show itself inside, in front of the flag-draped casket. Jim Newman, WCCO Television News, at the state capitol in St. Paul.
It seems that everyone had a reason. Everyone with whom we talked, well, they didn't say, oh, well, we were here because he was a great man and we want to pay our respects. No, they, almost virtually everyone with whom we talked, or Jim or Barry had talked, was able to cite some kind of experience, some kind of an adventure that they had had with Hubert Humphrey. When you get, 15, 20,000 people passing through there, you have a pretty good measurement of how many people's lives he touched down through the years.
Well, Al Austin is at the airport right now, and he reports that the delegation is starting to arrive, and we'll cut to Al right now. Al?
Yes, Doug. Doug, that's right. They have started to arrive early, about 15 minutes early by my calculations, and the two planes down so far have taxied to a spot about 300 yards from us, and they've asked that cameras not come down there, so all we can give you at the moment is a long shot. The two planes should be carrying, well, here are some of the people who should be on those two planes. Senator and Mrs. Howard Baker of Tennessee, Senator Robert Byrd of Virginia, Jacob Javits of New York, Senator and Mrs. Ed Muskie of Maine, and I'm sure everyone knows how closely that name has been tied with Senator Humphrey's. Three congressmen are on the first plane from Minnesota, Congressman and Mrs. Hagedorn, Congressman Don Fraser of Minneapolis, and Arvon Fraser, Congressman Richard Nolan, the 6th District Congressman, and some White House officials not particularly recognizable. In the second plane, Senator and Mrs. Church. Senator McGovern was scheduled to be on the second plane. As I say, we're quite a ways from those two planes, and I can't see the congressmen. They're loading onto buses, and they'll be going to House of Hope Church directly from here, and they're early. Congressman James Overstar is on the second plane, along with Bruce Vento, and Congressman Al Ullman of Oregon, and Peter Rodino of New Jersey. There should be 2 more planes now carrying members of Congress, and then the 5th plane, a small one, carrying President Carter. His limousine has been flown in and is standing by here beside me. He is due in at 1:35, but if that goes according to the way these early arrivals have gone, he'll probably be here before that. Now back to you, Dave and Doug.
You know, I thought it was rather interesting the other day when former President Nixon was at the ceremonies in Washington. It was odd to see him there, and I noticed in the press today that a number of people did take jibes at him. They accused him of, this was his first visit back to Washington since leaving as president, and they accused him of using the occasion for his own purposes to make his comeback into the public light. And I don't think that was very fair. I think that Nixon really had a true regard for the Senator Humphrey. I think that there was really a great deal of feeling between the two men.
I think that you will find that in anybody who has been in public life. People will misinterpret someone's actions because of their past actions. I'm sure there are hundreds of thousands of people here in this country who will never, ever forgive President Nixon.
Well, when I was watching Nixon, I was wondering at the same time, there he was watching this tribute to Senator Humphrey, and here was the victor, the man who had won the presidency, the one who had run the 68 race, and still all the tribute was going to Senator Humphrey. And I was just fascinated. I kept on wondering whether Nixon was wondering if he would get that kind of thought when he passes away.
I'm afraid he should not anticipate that sort of thing. I didn't see all of those ceremonies. Was at any time in the periphery of the ceremonies was Richard Nixon interviewed? Did anyone talk to him in the press?
Not that I know of. He pretty much stayed back in the crowd and was very calm in that. There was a notice in the paper today that fire severely damaged the childhood home of Mrs. Nixon in California early today. The blaze destroyed about 80% of that dwelling, and I often wondered if there was some kind of connection between the presidents.
Well, to be sure, they've had little but grief since the incident and since the President Nixon's resignation. I'm just a little now. We have a picture. We have Al Austin and Larry Schmidt back at Twin Cities International. I'm just looking at that picture. Al mentioned earlier, that the arrival of the congressman was quite premature. I think they were due in at 1 o'clock. The first of 4 jets landed at 1:45. President Carter's limousine had been flown in. That has been here prematurely. President Carter and Mrs. Carter are due to arrive at 1:35, and Al had hinted that if the schedule goes the way it has now, they may be expected to arrive earlier than that. And still the body arrives. In about 7 minutes from now, the motorcade escorting the senator's body to the House of Hope Presbyterian Church will leave the state capitol, and still they come in. They still, right up to this very minute. I heard someone estimate this morning, I think it was on the radio, they figured 20 to 25,000 people will have encircled the casket. All right, now we're ready to return to Al Austin at Twin Cities International.
Dave, Larry Schmidt has just returned from down near the plains where the congressmen have been alighting. What do you find out, Larry?
Well, Al, first of all, we find out that there are going to be more than 4 planes. There are maybe a total of 6, but they're coming from different locations. There are 4 coming from Washington. 1 flew in from New Orleans just shortly, a few minutes ago. And another plane, which I understand is bringing a contingent that have been traveling with State Department authorization. Senators, congressmen, and staff members have been in China, apparently. Senator Cranston, one person in that on that plane, and Senator Abrisk of South Dakota also there. And we saw Senator Eastland, the president of the Senate. He's already arrived. And Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, is here also. but they were in a separate motorcade, and apparently they're kind of circulating around the apron of the airport here as if they're going to go in one caravan, and there are about 6 buses standing by to be filled as the other planes come in on schedule.
So these 2 planes that have landed so far are additions?
That's right. They're just coming from different places.
Okay. Back to you, Dave.
We're 5 minutes away from the departure of the casket containing the body of Senator Humphrey from the state capitol. If just to refresh you a little bit, the funeral services, the memorial services, or the services at the Hope Presbyterian Church will begin at 2 o'clock on Summit Avenue. From there, maybe I ought to review these. Yes, the interment will take place at Lakewood Cemetery at the foot of Hennepin Avenue in South Minneapolis at 4 o'clock. And of course, we here at WCCO Television will provide coverage for you from our WCCO Television downtown studios to the state capitol, where lies the body of Senator Humphrey, to Twin Cities International Airport, where Al Austin and Larry Schmidt are standing by awaiting the arrival of President Carter, to the Hope Presbyterian Church on Summit Avenue, which is about 2 miles from the state capitol.
Senator George McGovern of South Dakota, who also sought the presidency but failed, called Senator Humphrey the most creative lawmaker of his generation. 30 years ago, he called on his fellow citizens to walk out into the sunlight of human rights. He made Minnesota a model of progressive politics. His leadership energized the force of liberalism across the Midwest. And there was also a note today that former Japanese Prime Minister Miki announced in Tokyo that the Japanese government would donate $1 million to the Hubert Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota.
You know, some wonderful words, quoting Senator McGovern, some memorable words have come out of this sad occasion. I was really struck yesterday, and I didn't really realize it until Vice President Mondale vocalized it, that not only did they were the last words of the Vice President's eulogy tribute, not only did Senator Humphrey teach us how to live, now he has taught us how to die. I guess there can't be a more exemplary example of facing death than that of Senator Humphrey. Do you remember, Doug, it was between the Vikings Dallas game and the Super Bowl game when the 3 front 4, Eller, Marshall, and Alan Page went to visit Senator Humphrey. It seemed to be us the very first indication that he was probably on his way. It was very difficult for him to speak. There was just the grim pallor became even more so. It indeed did not look as though he were enjoying the occasion at all. And that, I think we talked about it at the time, and everyone indeed in the studio felt at that time, this is it. This is the beginning of the end.
But at the same time, you know, every time you saw him, he was so positive. He would not allow people to feel sorry for him. That is not what he wanted. He was one of the most positive human beings I've ever seen. Coretta King, the widow of civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., called Humphrey, she said, he's the most outspoken and courageous leader in the Senate. And she said that we have lost a great friend, and that is something that all of us here feel.
Perhaps, if you care to go back this far, probably not since Patrick Henry's speech, has there been such a moving speech, and as it turned out, prophetic speech of the freshman senators in 1948 on the floor of the Senate about the Civil Rights Bill, which became the prophecy materialized in 1964 with the passage of the bill. Strange, isn't it strange when you stop to think back on history that of what is right, all politics transcends. Senator Humphrey's speech in 1948, General President Eisenhower's activation of the first real activity of the Human Rights Bill in Little Rock, Arkansas back in 1954. President Johnson's back to the Democratic Party again, the promulgation of those same civil rights. And everyone has, it doesn't matter what your politics, what's right's right. And the senator was, of course, the leading advocate of human rights for all.
Well, he had such intelligence and at the same time so much humor, and the combination was always so